Thank you also very much for this kind invitation. It is a great pleasure for me to be here, not only because I expect to learn a lot from you all, and in fact already learned a lot from you all about the intricate connection between missions and science. I also really appreciate the opportunity to present my work on African American missionaries as part of this workshop, as I believe that missions in science are a context into which the African American mission must be placed, and at the same time these are contexts in which the Black mission is not usually acknowledged. So as you see from my title, the perspective I propose to develop on the topic of African American missionaries has to do with photography. This is because in the mid-19th century, photography began to play a major role in reifying human variety on papers that ethnographers then could organize into racial hierarchies that put Europeans on top. Many scholars, including all of the people here in the room, have shown that missionaries played no small role in creating this photographic record. As actors who operated on the forefront of reaching out to non-Christian populations, they used cameras to make the need for and the impact of their missionary labors in the heathen world intelligible to distant observers, usually in Europe. The photographic logic of the mission that followed from this practice was hinging upon visualizing difference, not just regarding religion, but often also regarding society, culture, race, and civilization. That said, photography needs to be nonetheless considered a slippery tool of scientific description, albeit contemporaries, for the most part, held the medium to be truthful and objective. Scholarship has made a strong case for the instability of photography regarding its causal links to instrumentalist notions of vision, as for instance, ethnographic classification, by showing that its alignment with ideologies of social, cultural, or racial alterity often was ambiguous. In my paper here today, I would like to pick up on this strand in scholarship and explore one way in which the fixation of people in classificatory systems of race and otherness that photography so liberally provided can be nuanced. To this end, I will approach the photographic archives of race from the perspective of the notoriously marginalized photography that racial others, in my case Black Americans, have created, and trace how they constructed their own others and themselves by drawing upon systems of ethnographic description. My goal in what follows is specifically to introduce the photographic record African American missionaries have produced of Africa in the first half of the 20th century. For practical reasons, I will focus on the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which I will abbreviate in the following as AME Church. And this is because this is the oldest independent Black church of the United States, that as such became one of the few African American churches that maintained a mission in Africa throughout its colonization. So it became increasingly difficult for African Americans to enter the African continent, but the AME Church managed to be present throughout the entire period. So I would like to begin by characterizing the relationship between the African American missionary movement and photography, and then discuss the body of pictures that came out of this movement. And here I will point out two characteristics that kind of bound this wide array of heterogeneous images together into sort of a collective discernible system. One concerns the intersection of African American missionary photography with the photographic work of ethnography, and the other one concerns the autoethnography of the Black American mission. And I borrow the term autoethnography from Mary L. Pratt to underscore that the photography of the AME mission was shaped in the contact zone between African American transnationalism and African colonial cultures of ethnographic representation. As such, AME missionaries indeed incorporated rather than rejected the often condescending ethnographic representations that colonizers imposed on Blacks into their self-descriptions. So this is kind of the meaning that Mary L. Pratt attaches to the term autoethnography. Taken together, these steps will approach race as an ethnographic practice of the Black American missionary that manifested materially in photographs and archives that informed new programs of Black sameness and difference in the realm of Black self-representation. So let's begin with a few words on the African American mission and photography. The photographic record of the African American missionary movement was shaped in the period that Maud just described, between the 1870s and the 1940s, which also was the period in which the movement got underway. During this time, the biggest part of the African American missionary presence in Africa was owed to racist hiring policies in major white missionary agencies, who believed that Black Americans could serve in tropical areas known as the white man's grave. In addition, a number of independent Black churches started to send their staff for mission work to Africa. Unlike white sending institutions, they saw the mission as a special duty to foster racial uplift among Blacks beyond the United States. The one mission that did so most successfully and persistently under the increasingly averse condition of European colonialism was the aforementioned AME Church. Around the turn of the 20th century, this eminent independent African American institution established congregations in an area stretching from Cape Town to north of the Zambezi River and received approximately 40,000 African members. Despite African American missionaries often had a more compelling impact on African populations than their white counterparts, the size of this group remained comparatively small. One estimate has it that there were no more than 600 Black American missionaries total over the period in question. Their numerical presence peaked in the early 20th century with just over 115 Black missionaries that were then deployed in Liberia, the Belgian Congo, Sierra Leone, South Africa, Nigeria, Mozambique, Cameroon, Angola, and southern Rhodesia. Notwithstanding these small numbers, the Black segment of the Western missionary movement developed a strong relationship to photography. By the time the Black American mission started, photography had become a standard component of all kinds of missionary activities, and thus was used by African American staff to no lesser extent than by their white counterparts. This can be evidenced just like from a superficial survey of pertinent collections. So finding aids habitually list items like photographs, photo albums, flexible nitrate film, glass negatives, panoramic photos, Kodak cameras, and film strips. Likewise, Black missionary publications feature extensive lists of illustrations, usually reproduced from photographs by means of halftone printing. And this was a technology that simulated continuous tone by breaking images up into dots with varying distance. And the technology made it possible to integrate pictures with text and to mass produce them, like put them into mass print since the 1870s about. So the density and the variety of the visual accounts in African American missionary records indicates that Black American missionary work was much more diverse and much firmer entrenched in the web of relations photographic technology bred around Africa than has been commonly acknowledged. As such, these records at the same time underscore a racial divide that prevails not only in missionary archives. The divide also has marginalized the visual output of the Black American mission in the scholarly attention. We see this problem in the growing body of historiography on missionary photography specifically, that does not mention the photographic work of African American missionaries. And we see it in the recent move to establish like huge digital visual archives, such as the International Missionary Photography Archive, that do not include the Black American record in their global platforms. So this condition basically throws the historical investigation of African American missionary photography back to surveying accounts that are scattered across a wide variety of archives. And this is just a disclaimer. This is what I've done. It's not comprehensive. It's just a start. And to make the case that we need to overcome this divide for the sake of understanding race, not as a dividing line between black and white, but as a link between missions and science. I will now exemplify how photography entered the AME mission. So as already mentioned, cameras were almost as ubiquitous on the mission field as Bibles by the early decades of the 20th century, and a fascination with photography has characterized the broad spectrum of North American missionaries and their sending agencies, denominational mission boards, the Protestant women's missionary movement, independent evangelical missions, and various Catholic missions. The turn to photography that can be observed in the AME mission in this era thus is no exception. However, the notions AME missionaries associated with the medium were specific. As a technological device that, like no other, held out the hope to deliver the exact likeness of a person and an accurate record of events, AME missionaries viewed photography primarily as a means to assert their own on-site vision of Africa against oversimplifying discourses that constructed Africa as the dark continent and its descendants, including African Americans, as an inferior race. One statement by an AME missionary from the 1920s nicely exemplifies the look beyond this dominant regime of vision AME missionaries achieved because they were among the very few African Americans who actually really went to Africa. So this missionary wrote, I quote, "Africa has so long been discussed in terms of heathenism, savagery, uncharted wastes, untracked mountains, and utter negation of things civilized, that the visitor here may be rudely shocked, daily, hourly, by his discovery of conditions and things antipodal to his erstwhile impression," unquote. Using photography was a response to the distortions and misrepresentations AME missionaries discovered in the existing regimes of colonial gazing. Since the 1890s, the beginning of the AME mission, they routinely included photographs in travelogues, reports, and periodicals, not just to document their missionary labors. They also saw photographs as a tool to assert a counter-knowledge that challenged the authority of Western standards of knowledge production and its patterns of representation. The first travelogue published by AME missionary in 1895 was groundbreaking in this direction, and as such shaped the beginning of the critical black missionary photographic tradition. So here you see the cover page. The travelogue was called Glimpses of Africa, and it was written by the AME missionary Charles Spencer Smith. As you see, this account was not only called Glimpses of Africa, but also made those glimpses available to African American observers by means of many illustrations. This is like the bottom line. At that time, presenting photographs that were collected by an African American visitor of the continent was a novelty in the African American vision. Smith accordingly conceptualized the images as components of an unprecedented fact-finding mission that was driven by his notion that, I quote, "much error, particularly in reference to Africa, has been propagated by writers who do not confine the subjects of their books to their own observations," unquote. His photographs served him accordingly in his undertaking to distinguish his account as one that was genuine and reliable because it was based on his own personal observations. And these observations then were like materialized in the photographs. Smith was not alone with this reasoning that truth and knowledge about Africa was not to be found in Western books and libraries, but in seeing the continent with one's own eyes. Over the next decades, many more AME travel accounts harnessed the discourse about the errors of Western science to enhance their subjectivity in the mold of the photographing participant observer. This was not only an important inversion of the contemporary use of photography as a tool to generate all-encompassing, objective, and accurate systems of description. It was, more importantly, the beginning of the creation of a black system of visual description of Africa. And this brings me to my second part, the AME photographic record. So the The question at hand now is, of course, what the contents were that AME missionaries constructed as their personal observation. At first, it must be noted that the personalized approach to visually describe Africa resulted in a remarkably liberal photographic record. So AME missionaries harnessed the energies of photographers from a wide social spectrum, ranging from professional photo studios to African and African-American amateur photographers, thereby securing in the first place a continuous flow of images across the Atlantic into Black American congregations. Depending, in addition, on the state of technological improvements, this body of photographs reflected the full width of contemporary styles and conventions. Nonetheless, there was a set of specific photographic practices and themes that structured the wide array of visual accounts the AME mission produced into a somewhat collective system. And this was the depiction of African natives, paired with pronouncements about their location in an ethnographic descriptive system. So the construction of the native began most conspicuously with Smith's account, Glimpses of Africa. Smith did not have access to an own camera and thus purchased his photographs from the photographers in Africa that specialized in providing spectacular images of places and people for metropolitan observers. As a result, more than half of his 69 illustrations showed Africans in the frozen pose, staged in exotic-looking studio settings that served to enhance their labeling as types of a certain ethnographic classification. And here you see two examples from the book. Both are styled as ethnographic pictures by means of staging a group of people in a depersonalized fashion, exhibiting physiognomic over individual features by, for instance, means of dresses and body posture, as well as by inserting the group into a presumably natural environment. The captions underscore these group features by designating their tribal affiliations and locate them, in addition, in a binary scheme of civilization, according to which both tribes are uncivilized. And this categorization runs throughout the book. So he's always classifying the pictures as showing civilized people or uncivilized people. While Smith presented such photographs for a lack of alternatives, it was in fact really, like by the time he was traveling, impossible to bring camera equipment into interior locations. Later AME accounts that contain such imagery underscore that AME missionaries actively perpetuated ethnographic perspectives on Africans. This is most obvious with a sample of photographs that was passed on among different generations of AME missionaries, and that thus contributed to the long-term placement of the notoriously flamboyant, ahistorical, and unchanging African native in the African-American vision. And here you see three examples from a photo collection compiled by AME missionary Levi J. Coppin, who drew these pictures together in the 1900s in South Africa. So I don't know if you can read it. They show from right to left a high-class native girl, a person in native costume, and the way native women carry their children. And what is interesting about this set of images is that they occurred first in Coppin's account in 1905, but they reoccur, like in several later accounts, until the 1920s. Basically, all of these three pictures are studio-made photographs that by means of visual codes and the caption classify the depicted as natives. But the fact that they traveled across several missionary generations allows us to conclude that African-American missionaries kind of created a stock of purchased ethnographic images that were made available for illustrative purposes, like for many, many decades. An even more powerful example of AME missionaries' concern for keeping ethnographic conventions alive in their depictions are the images of natives that they themselves were staging. This practice became predominant in the 1920s and 1930s when handheld cameras liberated photography from studios, yet not from the motifs, styles, and conventions studio photography had created. And we can illustrate this phenomenon with, this is like a private scrapbook by an AME missionary who worked in South Africa in the mid-1920s. And we see that he reiterates the older theme of Native women carrying their children that we have seen in the previous slide. The difference is that these are clearly amateur photographs taken more spontaneously in some outdoor space. Nonetheless, and he's like also very careful with labeling the pictures. So all the pictures retain a classic ethnographical framing and captions that identify tribal affiliations, and in an arrangement of the three pictures into a group that displays a particular shared native feature, the baby sling, that is then somewhat playfully relabeled as a natural perambulator. But basically, it's the same strategy of representation. Such visual taxonomies show us that the photographic record of AME missionaries was profoundly shaped by a persistent intersection with, and later on, emulation of ethnographic photography. While this finding allows us to consider AME missionary photography as a contribution to the scientific ambitions of the Western missionary movement, it raises the question of how AME missionaries reconciled this photographic practice with the critical attention they had as black subjects for the function such images had in schemes of racial domination and subordination. And I just want to bring up this quote again by Levi J. Coppin, whose native image collection shaped AME visuals for generations. So on top you see the images again. And the statement shows that AME missionaries were well aware of the fantasy image that they created. And Coppin is commenting here specifically on the effects of the science of ethnography. And he writes, I quote, "A gentleman who had not traveled through South Africa beyond Cape Town expressed a desire to go to the interior, that he might see a genuine African, though he was daily meeting representatives of the various tribes. When asked what he expected to witness more than he had seen, his answer was that he wanted to see the true African type, with the characteristic thick lips, big feet, and receding foreheads. In other words, he wanted to see the image that was presented to him in the school geography. Many others, like the gentleman in question, are thus deluded." Unquote. So there is an enormous awareness in the African American mission for this problem. To understand the ethnographic impetus of African American missionary photography, we have to acknowledge a second trajectory in the photographic work that I have termed in the beginning of my talk as autoethnography. So before I come to my conclusion, I would like to highlight the workings of this type of race materialization, as it served AME missionaries to distinguish African Americans from Africans, rather than lump them together in the same category. A key strategy of developing autoethnographic difference visually was the stating of motifs that showed both groups at the same time. So unlike the examples that I discussed so far, which just only show Africans as ethnographic types, the depiction of racially similar people as mutual others in one image forms the most original photographic contribution of the AME mission. The tradition of self-portraits of AME missionaries in Africa is as old as their ethnographic endeavors. Again, already the first account, Glimpses of Africa, features such an image. And this is the self-portrait of Charles Spencer Smith, the author of the account. The image, I don't have to explain too much about it, I think, makes use of the usual social Darwinist strategies of visualization. It exhibits light and dark contrasts by means of clothing and background, and encodes these contrasts as binary oppositions that concern religion, progress, and civilization. Charles Spencer Smith, who is the only person identified in the caption, thereby emerges as the civilized man, surrounded by Africans from the Douala tribe, who constitute, as the caption says, his family, although only in the shape of inferiors, namely as kind of a race of children. This was the Christian discourse on human variety that tried to reconcile racial theorizing with the notion that humanity was universal and did not exclude backward people. Beyond these similarities with like colonial forms of representation in Christian discourses, however, the image brought to bear an entirely new vision. It constructed a black man in the place of the superior, and therefore suspended race as the most important rule of difference. By consequence, African Americans and Africans now differed along the categories of religion, culture, and civilization. To this is, interestingly enough, added the idea of adoption, a concept that designates a non-hereditary and therefore non-racial connection entered by a superior in the spirit of Christian charity. This idea was unprecedented in the African American community, that imagined its ties to Africa as either racial and therefore demeaning, or as brotherly and therefore equal. The visual repertoire Smith introduced to designate the otherness of Africans in view of African Americans set a lasting tone. We find this type of imagery continued up to the 1930s, when it also was liberally applied to both sexes. See, for instance, the self-representations of a married couple, Emily and William T. Vernon, who worked in South Africa from 1920 to 1924. Both deploy contrasts, as we have seen in the previous picture, of age, clothes, body size, to construct the Africans in the picture as their fundamental and also their inferior other. The gesturing, as in Smith's picture beforehand, bridges the gap by extending Christian guidance and the promise of charity to them. That this form of African American superiority was not solely a masculine concept is underlined especially by the depiction of Emily Vernon, and made explicit in the caption. So in the left picture, Emily Vernon is cast into the role of the mother of these children, while quotation marks signal that the evocation of family ties is meant metaphorically, and thus rather to be understood along the lines of a voluntary adoption. Similarly, Vernon's caption stages a process of adoption. It avoids notions of fatherhood, which for black men often connoted promiscuity and rape, in favor of describing him as kind of a discoverer and a shepherd who found a lamb in a Basuto kraal. So the visual repertoire of the adopted family gave room for both ethnographic depictions of African natives and personalized portraits of individual African American missionaries, while all the while asserting that race was not the basis of their connection. A critical attention for the potential generalizing scientific categorizations had to offer to describe black-black relationships thus was at the heart of the African American missionary photography in the first half of the 20th century. To conclude, in this presentation I have argued that African American missionaries established a link between missions and science in their photographic practice in Africa. This practice consisted in recoding pre-existing ethnographic depictions of the African native as a personal observation in the Black American vision. While this representation of the native and AME missionary accounts reveals the incorporation of scientific accounts others had made into the context of Black transnationalism, likewise formed the building block for a new kind of Black transatlantic self-representation. The fundamental theme here was the question if, and if yes, how African Americans and Africans were connected. And these loose voluntary ties coined the emblem of the adoption as a form of relation in which all participating parties could be fundamentally different. By deploying ethnographic schemes of difference, African American missionaries thus created a visual record of black variety in which the color line was not an issue. So interestingly enough, I just want to mention that briefly, there were never whites in the picture. They could have chosen that as a kind of other too, but they don't show up. Although these visual archives seem marginal compared to the huge photographic record of missions and science, they help us to capture the limits of each in instrumentalizing race as an ideology of subjection. As I have shown, an interest in racial sciences, especially ethnography, aligned the AME mission with the missionary and scientific photography of the day in Africa. Out of this alignment grew a practice of doing race that was not dictated by the racist gaze missionary ethnographers directed at the black body. In photographs of Africa, doing race meant to create a photographic archive from which new images of the African-American relation could be drawn. Thank you very much for your attention.